Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. Earlier today, the Prime Minister announced a series of labour reforms, but are they sufficient to revive Indian manufacturing and fulfil his Make in India promise? Or do they fall critically short of what industrialists really want? That's the debate in part two. But first, on the day the Cabinet Secretary convened an urgent meeting to assess India's preparedness to handle Ebola, we asked the same question. Does India have an effective and adequate system in place to handle what the World Health Organization calls the most severe acute health emergency in modern times? So far, India is lucky it hasn't faced a single Ebola case, but that could easily and suddenly change. If it does, how effective will be the country's response? That's the first discussion tonight. And now joining me to discuss India's preparedness to handle Ebola is former Health Secretary K. Sujata Rao, former Vice Chairman of the National Disaster Management Authority M. Shashidhar Reddy, the Chairman of the Institute of Critical Care at Medanta Medicity Yatin Mehta, and the Vice President of the Public Health Foundation of India, Ramanan Lakshminarayan. Surprisingly but very sadly, no one from the World Health Organization was willing to join us tonight. Shashidhar Reddy, mercifully there has been no confirmed case of Ebola in India so far, but equally, that can very quickly and suddenly change. So let me ask you a simple question. As someone who's been Vice Chairman of the National Disaster Management Authority, how well prepared is India to handle the first Ebola case if it were to happen?
Well, before I come to that, let me say that, President Obama had stated that there won't be, Ebola will not enter the US, and the very next day the first case was reported. So we cannot, feel that, we haven't any cases so far. And as far as preparedness is concerned, I think it's a very serious issue. The kind of challenges that we have in this country, I think we are very far from being prepared. Yes, no doubt, the Health Ministry has set up certain, facilities at various airports. But I think the critical thing is about how the symptoms, which are very similar to so many other common ailments that people are suffering from. And then the fact that the incubation period is a long 2 to 21 days. These are all factors which will make it very difficult for us to cope with this. And I think many serious efforts have to be made.
Mr. Reddy, I'll come to the many serious efforts that have to be made, and in particular I'll pick up on the 2 points you made about the incubation period as well as the fact that the symptoms look very similar to just ordinary fevers. But first, Sujata Rao, let me ask you about the steps the government has taken. There is screening at airports for passengers coming from Ebola-affected countries like Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea, Congo and Senegal. So far, some 22,000 people have been screened, 1,200 identified as initially suspect, of which 485 were then quarantined. Now, as a former health secretary, do you believe that is a good, effective first step?
I think so, and I have reason to be a little optimistic at this moment. Because as you recall, in 2010 we were scared about the H1N1 and we controlled it very well. Similarly, we went through a SARS and we are able to control yellow fever not entering into the country. So we do have a good system of surveillance at the airport. But the point really is, I always fear the complacency can set in. And
airports. But the point really is, I always fear the complacency can set in, and the vigil has to be constant and continuous.
Absolutely.
So far so good. Yesterday they found someone, they suspected the person to have Ebola, it was checked out and he's okay. But the problem is that even if one enters, is the public health system strong enough to ensure contact tracing?
Can I stop you there?
Right there
Mrs. Rao, let me stop you there. Can I stop you there? I'll come to what happens when we detect the first case in a moment's time. Let's not jump ahead of ourselves. Let's stick for a moment, Yatin Mehta, to the nature of the screening that's happening at the airports. The problem with checking for temperature of suspect cases on arrival at the airport is that by the time the Ebola carrier has fever, he or she is already infectious. So by checking for temperature at the airport, you may identify a carrier, but that person could very possibly have already infected many people. So isn't it just a stage too late?
No, that is true, Karan, but I think there is no other way to do it, because the ELISA and the PCR tests are done only in 3 labs in India, which are very high intensity labs, grade 4 labs for communicable diseases. So that cannot be set up at the airports. Also, I mean, temperature is the first filter for, particularly for patients traveling from these parts of the world. So yes, surveillance is going on. It needs to be strengthened. Quarantine facilities need to be improved. And the government hospitals which are authorized to treat these patients should increase their isolation facilities.
Mr. Professor Lakshmi Narayan, I want to take up on this question of whether in fact you have an advanced mechanism of checking and stopping Ebola infected or potentially Ebola affected patients before they reach the airport. One of the things that's been canvassed is the idea of barring entry to India of travelers from Ebola affected countries. Now, do you think that would be just too draconian? And secondly, do you think it can be easily circumvented by the fact that they can approach India from second and third countries and not come directly? So is that an effective remedy or an ineffective and draconian measure?
Well, we've got to see Ebola for what it is. It is not a very transmissible disease compared to disease like measles, for instance. And we have to strike the appropriate balance between being serious about this but not panicking about it. And I think the measures that are in place right now are entirely appropriate. A lot to do with airport screening, is as much to reassure the public as it is going to perform a real public health need, because what is really critical is the stuff after we actually detect an Ebola patient. But certainly stopping people from an entire region when only 3 countries really have active cases, I mean, DRC has a different strain of Ebola, would be a bit much. And I think we should be careful about, not taking on those kinds of measures, but really focusing on what we do with infection control when we actually detect the first case of Ebola and make sure our systems are in place where we are. If anything, we should probably try to help people in the countries that they're at.
Well, one more question about trying to prevent people with Ebola infection coming to India before I come to the question of what you do if and when you get your first Ebola case. Yatin Mehta, writing in the New York Times, Siddharth Mukherjee, a professor of medicine at Columbia University and the author of the book, The Emperor of All Maladies, suggests the use of something called polymerase chain reaction, which he says amplifies the virus's genes and makes it easier to detect infections at a pre-symptomatic stage. Now, do you believe, Dr. Mehta, that is a good suggestion rather than just checking for temperature, which could be checking too late?
No, Karan, the thing is that the PCR, RT-PCR, which is used for Ebola diagnosis, has to be in a class 4 communicable disease lab, which has all the prophylactic and preventive measures to prevent infection spreading to the people working there. And there are particular way to transport the samples also. So these are very high equipped machines, which are very expensive. And at the moment, there are only 3 centers. One is in New Delhi, Center for Communicable Disease, one is in Virology Center in Pune, and one is in Bhopal. So they cannot be set up at the airports. There is no way you can do 300 or 400 travelers in one go. And that PCR report also takes time. It takes a couple of days before the report comes.
So in other words,
practical suggestion. No.
So in other words, what you're suggesting is Siddharth Mukherjee's proposal, written in the New York Times, with actually America in mind rather than India, is not a practicable proposal for India at any rate. It may be possible to do it in America, and of that, of course, we don't know, but it is not practicable in India. Have I understood you correctly, Dr. Mehta?
No, absolutely. And it's not practicable in the US also. I mean, they cannot do that.
All right. In which case, Sujata Rao, let's come to how effective our preparations would be if and when the first Ebola case is identified. Now, the government has identified one hospital with a dedicated isolation facility in each state. But the key question is, how well equipped are these hospitals? Can they really, particularly in the case of hospitals outside Delhi, Chennai, Bangalore, Hyderabad, Bombay, can they really handle the challenge of Ebola? Sujata Rao?
Is that directed to me, Karan?
No.
Sorry, Karan, your voice is doubling and it's coming at a resound, but I can get a sense of what you're saying.
Go ahead and answer in that case, please.
So can I...
Let me repeat the
Can
question.
I go ahead?
Yes, go ahead, please. Go ahead and speak.
Hello?
I'm waiting for you. No, I don't think...
Yeah, what you're trying to say is that, is that one hospital in Delhi enough for quarantining? I fully agree. I agree that that's not, and I think that the public health capacity for screening infectious diseases needs to be focused upon and given a top priority. I'm afraid that is not the case as on today. And I do think that we have to have more than these 3 laboratories equipped properly, and we need to have more quarantine facilities very quickly set up in all parts of the country. Particularly Chennai, Trivandrum, these are the airports where screening is being done right now. So I think they have to go ahead and prepare those hospitals also over there.
But one quick question, Mrs. Rao. Are you also saying that in addition to the one hospital per state being inadequate and the number of laboratories being inadequate, are you also saying that in many hospitals earmarked in states outside metropolitan India, they may not be up to the challenge itself? Is that also a consequence of the answer that you're giving me?
Yeah. It is a big concern because these are people who need to be very well trained. As you can see, it's the caregivers who really are most vulnerable to this infection. So they have to be very, very conscious of infection control procedures. Complete isolation has to be enforced. There's a whole protocol. And I'm not sure how much of training has gone into it. They have to work very quickly and very hard to see that people are sensitized and made aware, particularly the caregivers.
Now,
so I think this is a very important item which requires very quick action from the ministry.
Yatin Mehta, you're chairman of the Center for Critical Care at Vedanta Medicity. In America, already 2 nurses who had to look after the Ebola patient who sadly died have themselves got affected. Can we be certain in India that if there is an Ebola case, our nurses and our care attendants would be better protected? Or would you say to me, if you're being honest, that's very unlikely?
Yeah, you're right, because if this can happen in US, for 6 hours, the patient with Ebola was left in the open emergency room. The nurses were not given adequate equipment for protection. So these are expensive equipment. People need to have a correct supply. They need to be trained in it. And I'm sure the health ministry is working, but they need to be more proactive. Dr. Harshvardhan, I'm sure, is looking after it. RML doesn't have sufficient beds. So yes, we need to be more active in the prevention of this, because once we get it, it's going to be a disaster. We are never ever ready to disaster management.
Professor Lakshmi Narayan, as someone who's worked in public health practically all your life, what are the critical steps, what are the critical protocols and procedures the dedicated hospitals need to be aware of and ready to implement, so that when you get the first Ebola case, not only is he or she properly isolated, but those attending to him or her don't fall into danger, as happened sadly with 2 nurses in America? What are the critical steps that need to be taken? Do we have Professor Lakshmi Narayan? Because I don't think I can hear him.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Please go ahead, Professor Lakshman. Go ahead and answer the question.
Yeah, I do want to correct this part that although there were 2 secondary cases from that case in Dallas, there have been 5 other patients who've been treated in US facilities with no secondary cases whatsoever. So obviously things went wrong in Dallas, but it doesn't mean that the system entirely broke down in the US. It did for that particular instance.
That's a good
Turning to what happens in India.
Yes, absolutely. Can you answer that bit for me? Go ahead. What happens in India?
So what happens in India is, of course, that certainly there is a concern, because even if we don't handle routine infection control in a way that is up to global standards, and we certainly don't, there is a concern that we may not have the procedures in place for Ebola. Many hospitals do not have infection control professionals or nurses. Some do, but most do not. And that's evidenced by antibiotic-resistant bacteria freely flowing across hospitals. So there is a concern that if we rely on a number of facilities rather than one designated facility to be the isolation facility, we may be in trouble. And we should follow what countries like South Africa have done, which is to identify an isolation hospital in each province, which will be the designated facility. And as soon as we identify an Ebola patient, we don't take them to the nearest hospital,
can I
but take them to that
Professor
isolation
Lakshmi Narayan,
facility.
can I interrupt? You may not be aware, but
Sure.
that has been done in India. There is a dedicated hospital in each state that has been identified specifically, which has in turn a dedicated isolation facility. What I'm asking you is, after what happened to those nurses in America, what are the critical procedures and protocols that those hospitals should enforce to ensure we don't have lapses like happened in America? Can you identify 2 or 3 top protocols for me quickly?
Well, the one protocol that seems to have fallen apart in the US hospital was the appropriate taking off of infection control protective equipment. And it appears that the infection control nurse may have accidentally touched her face after taking off her equipment without actually washing her hands. So the thing about Ebola is that if you follow the rules that are very well laid out, secondary infections are relatively easy to prevent.
Okay.
But if you slip through, it's dangerous. So we have to make sure, I think as Sujata was saying, that the people that we have in these facilities know what they're doing, go through trial runs, and that they don't practice on the first Ebola patient that they ever see.
Okay. Now, I want to come back to you, Mr. Shashidhar Reddy, and pick up on that point that you made earlier about the prolonged incubation period, which, as you said, stretches from 2 days up to 21 days. Of the 1,200 patients who were initially deemed to be suspect, most, if not the majority, have gone to states like Maharashtra, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, West Bengal and Delhi. What sort of follow-up procedures should the government be implementing to ensure that these people are effectively monitored right up to the 22nd day when the incubation period ends, so that they are checked and their health is known about right through this possible potential danger period? What are the steps needed? Mr. Reddy?
Yes, please.
Can you answer that question for me? Did you hear it?
Yes, I did. I think a lot needs to be put in place. We need to go through these. We need a lot of training for people. The very fact that the protective
Can I stop you?
gear,
I'm not asking you a general question. I'm asking you about the specific procedures that need to be implemented to follow up on those people who are deemed infectious during the incubation period. They've gone to several states, 6 or 7 in India. What steps does the government need to take to make sure that they are effectively monitored?
Well, whatever guidelines may have gone from the health ministry, it has to be ensured that they are followed. And this is a very difficult thing, particularly in this country, I feel.
In other words, we don't follow guidelines when they're given. We have to make sure that someone supervises the following of guidelines. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, absolutely. And they need to understand the seriousness and, people need to be trained at different levels.
Okay.
And no doubt they have a nodal officer in each of these states, but I think they need to be a lot of interaction,
Okay.
international practices.
I take your point entirely. We need to make sure that the rules and guidelines we are laying down are actually observed and not simply left on paper. Sujata Rao, I want to move very quickly in the time limited beyond what the government has so far done to ask you what are the critical steps the government needs to implement, which it may not have thought of and may not have implemented. Now, the WHO believes that Ebola is the most severe acute health emergency in modern times. As a former health secretary, are there additional steps you would advise this government to urgently take? If there are, can you specify them quickly? No, we don't have Sujata Rao. I'm terribly sorry, but
I mean, the point, Karan, let's not get into a panic mode because this disease has been there since 1976. So it is definitely infectious and it has a certain protocol. My worry is not what's going to happen today and tomorrow because the whole media and the minister and everyone is focusing on it. But this should be routinized. Infection control procedures must be routinized, which means training, identifying the isolation wards, contact tracing. The earlier question you were asking what happens.
But can I interrupt you? You may be right in saying this disease has been there from 76 onwards, but this is the worst ever outbreak of the disease, and this outbreak has killed more people than all the other previous outbreaks put together, which is why I'm going to quote to you Margaret Chan, the Director General of the WHO. This is what she says. I have never seen a health event threaten the very survival of societies and governments in already very poor countries. I have never seen an infection disease contribute so strongly to potential state failure. So this is why I'm asking you, are there additional steps you think the government should take which it hasn't taken? If there aren't, I'll move on to the next person.
Karan, the point is they said the same when H1N1 took place. Sorry, hello?
Yes, I can hear you. Please finish your answer.
I can't hear.
Sorry, we seem to have a terrible lot of problems today
on?
with equipment, and I apologize to the audience. We have several failing OBs and live views right through the country. My apologies to the audience. Let me put that question to you, Yatin Mehta. You're speaking both as a doctor as well as a hospital administrator. Given what Margaret Chan, the Director General of the WHO, has said, are there additional critical steps that you think the government should consider which it hasn't considered?
No, as I said, that it starts from the airport, because there's not, I was going through how much of staff is there at the airports, particularly at the airports where this travel from West Africa is very high. They need to increase the staff, not only the surveillance staff but also the doctors who are around 24/7 there. Also, they need to improve the quarantine facilities at these major airports, which we don't have adequate facilities. The staff training also may be questionable, so we need to be aggressive about training the staff. And the personal protective equipment needs to be supplied. These are expensive equipment which may not be easily available. Even the mask which is used for these patients, N95 mask, is not available everywhere. So RML hospital doesn't have enough beds. So suppose we get a large number of patients, there is no way to isolate them. The isolation facilities have to be with a negative pressure, with an ante-room, with an attached bathroom. So there are specific guidelines of how this spread can be prevented. So I don't think we are ready for it, and we should get ready for it.
All right, that's a very dire prognosis that you've given.
Also, you rightly said that 21 days of follow-up is not being done. I think we should be, just because a guideline is made, not necessarily it is being followed. So somebody has to audit it.
All right, I'm going to end with you, Dr. Mehta. I hope the audience is listening, and more importantly, I hope the government is listening. We have to be prepared, but as you put it, we are not ready for it. We do not have enough staff for the detection. We do not have hospitals that are potentially deep enough to carry out the necessary work if we have a large number of patients. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. Let's keep our fingers crossed and hope we don't get that first Ebola patient, but God forbid if we do. You're saying to me, both as a practice doctor and as a hospital administrator, we are not ready to cater for the extent of the crisis we could face. My thanks to all four of my guests for joining me, and once again, my apologies to the audience for the terrible technical problems we've had practically with every single one of my guests tonight.